First of all, I'd also like to mirror the acknowledgement made this morning and the gratitude that we're on Coast Salish and Snoqualmie land. And to thank very much not only the speakers this morning for getting this conference off to a very powerful and meaningful start, but to the organizers. Those of us who have been involved in organizing conferences in the past know how much of a job that is and really take our hats off to them. On this question of treaty interpretation, just a quick historical note and then off we'll go. When I started looking into this as a law student over 35 years ago, the issue was, did these treaties have any status at all? Some people thought they were just contracts. Others said they couldn't be international treaties because they hadn't been ratified by Parliament. And that was when awareness of the treaties in the non-Aboriginal world was just beginning. Before that, of course, they were invisible almost for several generations. So that's, in a sense, what this session is about. Looking at these treaties and looking at them not just through the lens of the Anglo-legal world, but through the other side of the transaction, if I can call it that. We have 4 speakers today, and you have their bios in your package, so I don't want to eat up the valuable time of both the panelists and you in terms of question and discussion by saying a lot about them. The order will be Neil Vallance, and then Chris Arnett, and then Clo Ostrove, and then Bruce Miller. And so we'll begin with Neil Vallance. I'll just tell you a little bit about Neil. Neil has practiced law for, I think, about 30 years. He has degrees in law and anthropology. He's a remarkable man, and he is now doing his PhD dissertation at the University of Victoria on the Vancouver Island treaties. So it'll be the first time that there will be if you like, a book-length study of those treaties. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Neil and ask him to tell you a little bit about the treaties from his point of view. Neil.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for being here. First, I would like to thank the Snuneymuxw people. Most of what I know about the treaties I have learned from reading the words of your ancestors and elders. Thank you so much. Now, my title is a little provocative. Do any of the Vancouver Island treaties contain a conveyance or surrender of land? I could just answer no and leave it at that, but I should probably say a bit more. I will attempt over the course of the next 15 minutes to persuade you that none of the Vancouver Island treaties contains a conveyance, quitclaim, cession, surrender, or whatever of land from First Nations to the Hudson's Bay Company or the British Crown. To do so, I will have to grossly oversimplify the argument and ignore many complexities and problems, but here goes. For over 100 years, the document you see on the screen and its 13 sister documents were accepted without question as the so-called Douglas Treaties. 11 were entered into at Fort Victoria, 2 at Fort Rupert, and 1 at Nanaimo. Now, for my purpose today, the relevant portion is the first paragraph, which reads as follows. Know all men, we, the chiefs and people of the Titchimitsha tribe, a component of the Songhees, who have signed our names and made our marks to this deed on the 29th day of April, 1850, do consent to surrender entirely and forever to James Douglas, the agent of the Hudson's Bay Company, blah, 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 the whole of the land situate and lying between Esquimalt Harbor and Point Albert, etc. Now, over the last 50 years, it has become accepted that, as stated by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2006 in R.V. Morris, quote, the treaty, in that case the North Saanich Treaty, was concluded orally and subsequently reduced to writing. For the balance of my presentation, the treaties concluded orally will be referred to as the Vancouver Island Treaties, and those reduced to writing will be referred to as the Douglas Forms. The reason for using the word forms will become apparent later. Now, the court went on to say that the oral promises made when the treaty was agreed to are as much a part of the treaty as the written words. In other words, according to the court, the treaty consists of the written words plus any oral promises. As the quitclaim provision is clearly part of the written words, the court took for granted, quote, the surrender by the Saanich of their lands on Vancouver Island, unquote. However, in 1984, the BC Court of Appeal, in the decision of R.V. Bartleman, had adopted a more radical approach to the Douglas forms. The main judgment was written by Lambert J.A., who disclosed that, quote, I have examined at the Provincial Archives the foolscap notebook inscribed Register of Land Purchases from Indians, where the written components of the 11 Fort Victoria treaties were recorded, and he concluded that, quote, I do not think that the text of the land grant recorded in the register should be regarded as anything more than some evidence of what was generally agreed to. I agree with that, and I propose to go one step further. Granted that the Douglas forms constitute some evidence of a surrender of territory, does the historical record provide any additional evidence? My research has turned up several documents relevant to the question, but in my opinion, they mostly contradict rather than confirm the presence of a quitclaim in the Vancouver Island treaties. Now, at this point, I wish to make it clear I believe the Vancouver treaties do exist, but they do not include a surrender of land. I will now move on to an exceedingly brief outline of my research. The First Nations representatives who met with Douglas in 1850 likely would have understood the purpose of those meetings in the context of their previous dealings with the Hudson's Bay Company. Their first agreement with the HBC occurred in 1843 when Douglas obtained the permission of the local First Nations to build a fort on their land. Their interactions with the company would have grown more numerous and complex as its operations gradually expanded beyond the walls of the fort. By 1850, both Douglas and nearby First Nations may have felt it was time to update and formalize their existing arrangements. Now, the Post-Journal for Fort Victoria was kept by a character name of Roderick Finlayson, one of the two European witnesses to the Titchimidse Treaty. His journal entry for that day, April 29, 1850, provides the only contemporaneous account of any of the treaty meetings. The exciting bit comes at the end, quote, in the evening, the proprietors of the tract of country lying between the headland and Point McGregor were paid for their land. They are 10 in number and got 3 blankets, 2.5 points each, at which they appeared well satisfied, unquote. Now, unfortunately, Finlayson was never one to expend many words on events at the fort. It also needs to be noted that other than company employees, there were almost no European residents or transients in Victoria at that time, and none of them recorded the event. 8 more treaties were entered into over the next 2 days. Now, on May 16th, 1850, Douglas gave his account of this 3-day event to his boss, Archibald Barclay, Secretary of the Hudson's Bay Company in London. The first relevant section of the letter is as follows, quote, after considerable discussion, it was arranged that the whole of their lands forming, as before stated, the District of Victoria, should be sold to the company with the exception of village sites and enclosed fields for a certain remuneration to be paid at once to each member of the tribe. And his report ended with these extraordinary words, quote, I attach the signature of the native chiefs and others who subscribe the deed of purchase to a blank sheet on which will be copied the contract or deed of conveyance as soon as we receive a proper form, hence the term Douglas forms. Once we receive a proper form, which I beg may be sent out by return of post, unquote. A template was forwarded in August and received some months later. Douglas duly inserted the completed template wording onto each blank. Now, no copies of these completed conveyances were sent to the Hudson's Bay headquarters or to the Colonial Office, and to my knowledge, no copies were distributed to the First Nation signatories. In any event, it is highly unlikely that any of the First Nation participants would have been able to read the completed document at that time. Now, the originals were lodged at the fort and later at the office of the Department of Lands and Works in Victoria, available for inspection by prospective settlers looking for documentary confirmation that the quote-unquote Indians had been paid for their land, paving the way for the colony to grant an unencumbered title to purchasers. In my opinion, the only reason for insertion of formal quitclaim language into the Douglas forms was to reassure the Hudson's Bay Company, which had extensive land holdings around the fort, and other investors in land, that there would be no troublesome land claims by treaty First Nations in the future. And that strategy has worked, unfortunately, well. I am not aware of any formal challenge to the surrender provision in the courts or otherwise over the past 162 years. So the next question must be, did the oral agreement contain a similar quitclaim provision? This in turn raises two subsidiary questions. First, what did Douglas say to the gathered First Nations? And secondly, what did the First Nations say to Douglas? Both questions are difficult to answer. As the template contained in the quitclaim wording did not exist at the time of the treaty meetings, it is certain that Douglas did not simply recite the wording of the Douglas form. A first-hand account of the events of April 30th to May 2nd was provided by Joseph Mackay, a Hudson's Bay Company clerk who witnessed the Titcha and the other 10 Fort Victoria treaties. However, his recollection came 38 years after the event, so it's hardly contemporaneous. The entire text is fascinating and controversial, but there are two parts that are particularly relevant to my task today. The first reads as follows. The then Secretary for the Colonies sent to Mr. Douglas, through A. Barclay, Esquire, HBC Company Secretary, instructions as to how he should deal with the so-called Indian title. The instructions were embodied in a somewhat lengthy document, which began by reciting the general views of the home government in regard to the land rights of Aborigines in the countries where they might be found sojourning. Sounded like they were the visitors. Mr. Douglas was very cautious in all his proceedings. The day before the meeting with the Indians, he sent for me and handed me the document above referred to, telling me to study it carefully and commit as much of it to memory as possible in order that I might check the interpreter Thomas, should he fail to explain properly to the Indians the substance of Mr. Douglas's address to them. I definitely need to find out more about Thomas, who appears to have been saddled with the Herculean task of explaining to the assembled First Nations, quote, the general views of the home government in regard to the land rights of Aborigines, unquote. The problems of translation are obvious and serious, but I won't delve into them here. Now, the second extract is much shorter. Mackay was adamant that, quote, Mr. Douglas made no purchase of the country from the Indians, unquote. This theme was taken up by Dr. Helmken, a contemporary of Douglas, in a letter to the editor of the Daily Colonist published in 1886. With respect to the, quote, conveyance wording, unquote, in the Douglas treaties, Dr. Helmken had this to say, it matters not how the papers were made out, the Indians not having any legal right in land could not have given any conveyance of land, unquote. As far as the good doctor was concerned, quote, Sir James made treaties of amity and friendship and paid for them as a matter of policy, unquote. Now, it is time to discuss accounts provided by First Nation witnesses to the meetings with Douglas. There are at least 4 such accounts, which, over time, have been reduced to writing. 2 are by David Latesse, chief of the Tsartlip, First Nation, describing the 1850 treaties and the 1852 North Saanich Treaty, both published in 1934. One is by Sinema Gelders Quenesthen, or Joe Wise, and his wife Sasaya, or Jenny, first published in 1933. And the fourth is by Sinema Gelder Dick Woacom, recorded in 1913. I only have time to discuss 2 of them very briefly. Chief Latesse gave an interview to a local journalist, which resulted in a long article in the Victoria Daily Times. Now, the article is full of insights and ambiguities, but for today's purposes, I will restrict myself to 2 short extracts. The first is as follows. In return for the use of meadowlands and open prairie tracts of Saanich, the white people would pay to the tribal chieftains a fee in blankets and goods. That was understood by us all to be payable each year. It was so explained to us by Joseph Mackay, the interpreter for Governor Douglas. And then the second snippet reads as follows. It was arranged that lands not needed by the natives might be occupied by the whites. He cleverly switched the emphasis from Douglas to the First Nations. In other words, the Saanich people were conferring certain privileges upon the Europeans, not vice versa. I need to do more research on that remarkable personship, Latesse. Second, in 1913, a Royal Commission on Indian Affairs visited Nanaimo to hear testimony from members of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. One such was Dick Woolcombe, who was 83 at the time and would have been 24 years old in 1854 when the Nanaimo Treaty meeting took place. And his name may well have been one of the 159 names listed on the Douglas form. I say may because cross-referencing of transliterated names is very difficult. Woolcombe made an opening statement and was then questioned by one of the federal commissioners, J. McKenna. For today, I want to highlight the following part of the exchange. Mr. McKenna, what do your people want today? Answer, what we want is to get the land back or to get some settlement. McKenna, you say that you and some other Indians brought down furs to Victoria and also coal. Before that time, were there no white men here? Answer, no, there were no white men before that. Question, then afterwards, Sir James Douglas came out? Answer, yes. Question, and you made treaty with Sir James? Answer, yes. And he said, the land is yours. Now, the complete text of Woolcombe's blunt but eloquent testimony before the Commission is both fascinating and brilliant, and is deserving of significant recognition in the treaty literature. Now, with that very superficial overview of my research, I must turn to the task of summing up. Writing in 1998, legal historian Sidney Herring acknowledged that, quote, the process of making the treaties was faulty by any standard, unquote. But he concluded that, quote, even the fact that the chiefs signed blank papers does not alter their validity as long as the words that were eventually added fairly recorded their oral agreement. Well, of course, I have been at pains this morning to demonstrate that the added words do not fairly record the terms of the oral agreement, insofar as the surrender provision is concerned. Fortunately, the Douglas forms are not the Vancouver Island treaties, and the discussion of what was in the Vancouver Island treaties will have to wait for another day. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Neil. We're going to have all four panelists present and then have questions and discussion. So the next panelist is Chris Arnett, and if you look at your package, you'll see all the biographical information there. I just want to stress his two fascinating books, The Terror of the Coast, Land Alienation and Colonial War in Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, and he edited Two Houses Half Buried in Sand, which I'm sure is a book many people here are familiar with. And Chris, over to you to talk about some deep background.
Okay. I might need help to find my PowerPoint here. Techie.
Is there a tech in the house?
Pardon?
Is there a tech in the house?
Yes, he's up there.
Anyway, before we get into that, I'd like to thank the Snuneymuxw Nation, past and present, for having me here. It's a great honor, and thank you to the organizers. It was dark, the day is beginning, the birds are singing, the people are stirring. It's a dark place, and now it's daylight. Ko raki te mauka, ko era te keo te wai, ko rakaiutu, ko paikea, na tangata, ko waitaha, ko ngati manoe, ko nai tahu, ko Pākehā, na iwi, ko John Norma Arnett, na mātua, ko Christopher Anderson, Arnett, taku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou kātawa. I just introduced myself as a member of Ngāi Tahu, the predominant tribe in the South Island, New Zealand. And I'm going to talk about a deed we arranged with the British in 1848. A deed, a land sale deed that became the template form for the so-called Douglas Treaty. Just to begin, yes, I want to give a context for the Douglas Treaty, and in the light of events that were going on in New Zealand and indeed over the world. And it's basically, the whole story is about two different versions, treaties between two worlds, treaties between two world views. On the right, we have the islands of New Zealand, Aotearoa, the North Island, Te Waiponamu, South Island, Te Rakalira, the extreme South Island. This is the territory of Ngāi Tahu. You're a hunter-gatherer people. About 1800, there were 10,000 of us, as opposed to 100,000 people living in the North Island. The North Island's an agricultural area, and we are hunter-gathering people. Up on the right, we have the Treaty of Waitangi. I'm not going to talk much about this treaty. Some of you may know about it. It was negotiated in 1840. The British, when the official was sent here to negotiate a treaty with the Maori tribes, it's interesting, this treaty has its origins really in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And there's a scholar, Simon Halu, I believe, from the University of Alberta, wrote a really interesting paper saying that this was the Royal Proclamation in action. I won't get into it in detail. There's 3 articles. The first article was about Kawanatanga, governorship. It's just a word. We didn't know what a governor was, whatever. We wanted to make a treaty with the most powerful nation on earth. And so the first clause, we recognized the Kawanatanga. And recognition was based on the second clause, or the second clause, in recognizing the Crown's right of preemption, which is also in the Royal Proclamation. We were guaranteed all our lands, fisheries, treasures, rights, unless we wanted to part with it at a price we were in agreement. The third article, clause, guaranteed us the rights of citizenship in common with the British. And the cool thing about this treaty is that it was written in Māori and in English, so both sides understood what was in it. Both sides interpreted it very differently. Just a brief thing. This is Ngāi Tahu. We have very similar culture to the people of the Northwest Coast. And the 2 most important things to us were the Kainga Noanga, which are our villages up here, longhouses, storage places, and our Mahinga Kai. Now check out that word Kai. Kai is food. Kai Noanga are villages, places. This is a place where we eat. These are food gathering areas. This is where we get the food. This is where we get the food. This is where we eat the food. And we were no strangers to the Europeans. You can see down here, this is a group of Ngāi Tahu, 1840, with a whale boat. We're wearing European clothing. We had known the Pākehā for about 70 years. We intermarried with them. My ancestors, I'm a product of a union between English whalers and high-ranking women from Ngāti Māmoe and Ngāi Tahu. And so we let these people settle and live on the land. And this is prior to the British organizing the Treaty of Waitangi. Oh, maybe I should use this. This is our seasonal round, the Mahinga Kai, the food gathering places. This is just a heuristic to show you. These are different villages, and this is the different types of food we collected throughout the year. This was the basis of our economy. And you can see in January we've got certain foods, in the summer certain foods, they just become available at different times, just like here. My father, my uncles, my grandparents, my great-grandparents all partook in this traditional food gathering practice. But, so we were living okay, we were living with the Pākehā. But meanwhile, over in Europe, this is a really interesting picture. This is a labor movement. This is 1848. Now Europe, following the Napoleonic Wars, there's a lot of unemployment, there's a lot of social unrest, people are getting nervous about the working class. Huge labor movement called the Chartists. And one of the solutions was a guy named William Wakefield. He had a great idea. He said, I know, I hear these stories about places like New Zealand where the Maori, they'll sell land for nothing because they don't know the value of land. So isn't this a great idea? We'll organize a systematic colonization. That's what we called it. where we'll go there, we'll buy this land for next to nothing because the Maori don't know how the value of land. The settlers can go there, we can sell land, make tons of money, and everybody will prosper. And the rationale was that colonization will be good for the Maori. This will be a good thing. And it's funny, I was listening to the radio this morning, and the guy from Enbridge was talking, he was using the same kind of rhetoric. Oh, we're going to build this pipeline because, yeah, sure, there's going to be some destruction now, but it's going to be good for these people. They're going to love it. This is the rhetoric of Wakefield. So this is just giving you a context for the treaty. So where were we at? Naitaru population of 5,000 up here in the 1820s. We were hit with measles epidemics, warfare with tribes from the north that were raiding down. They were armed with muskets, and we didn't have the same kind of armament. When it came time, when the British started to come in, Treaty of Waitangi into some land sale agreements, this is where we're at. So half the population, there were 2,000 of us occupying half of New Zealand. So we were pressured into making land sale agreements. We were, we wanted the blessings of European civilization. And so these are the 8 different land sales that took place in the South Island of New Zealand. But I'm going to talk about this one, the big fat one in the middle, the Canterbury Block, 1848, bought for 2,000 pounds. And our chiefs, my ancestors, negotiated this sale. This sale became the prototype for the Douglas Treaty. Whakarongamai nai iwi katoa, no all man. This is the document. Our leaders negotiated this with the British, and we insisted certain things were in it. Like, again, we had no problem with the British coming here. We wanted to have the advantages of Western civilization. And this was written out in Maori. We understood what it said. And it was signed by 16 chiefs. Only 16. You see 40 signatures here. 30 of them are forgeries, but that's another story. This is the important part of the treaty. And those of you who are familiar with the Douglas Treaty might recognize some of the language. But basically, it's guaranteed the places where we eat and the places where we gather food. And how is this translated in the English version? It became our plantations. Well, they have our residences, but the plantations was glossed for mahingakai. Mahingakai is this huge, expansive word referring to all these different places we've got food and resources, and it's reduced to plantations. The other one, they promised us further additional land, and the word here is whakariti, obligation to provide this land for us in the future. And that was reduced to, we leave to the government the power and discretion of making us additional reserves of land. And of course, that never happened. We lost all our mahingakai, except for my family. Our family was able to hold on to it. And the promises of further land never materialized. There were oral promises made at this negotiation, hospitals, schools. None of that happened. This became the basis of our Naitaru claim, which we settled in 1997 after 148 years. One of the longest running land claims in history. Maybe BC First Nations will beat us to that. So I'm going to briefly get into the Douglas Treaty, Vancouver Island. This is Vancouver Island, 1847. Who's running the show here? We've got a little fort. There's a few Poinita, Pakeha, but First Nations are running the show. And this is an heuristic device from the Stalo Atlas. It's just a fancy way of showing the integrated nature of the indigenous economy. This is the Fraser River, Fraser Canyon areas. These red dots are villages. These are all food gathering areas. And people are going back and forth. People from Snuneymuxw went up the Fraser Valley and established villages. They have relationships with people up there. Incredible, intricate economy based on thousands of years. So Douglas, colony of Vancouver Island, established 1849. Douglas, he, I think, was following events in New Zealand. They must have known. 1848 was the big Naitaru deed. So he wrote, said, some arrangements should be made as soon as possible with the native tribes for the purchase of their lands. I would also strongly recommend, equally as a measure of justice, and from regard to the future peace of the colony, that the Indian fisheries, village sites, and fields should be preserved for their benefit and fully secured by law. The British agreed with this, but they were following events in New Zealand. This is Barclay, the Secretary of the Hudson Bay Company. The natives will be confirmed in the possession of their lands as long as they occupy and cultivate them themselves. They will not be able to dispose of them to any private person. And this is the Crown right of preemption. So he's thinking Treaty Waitangi, he's thinking Royal Proclamation. You know, we just, as long as they, you know, if you're going to sell land, they're going to sell it to us, sort of thing. And we don't want them selling it to some foreigners. But the right of hunting and fishing will be continued to them. The Mahingakai. So James Douglas, the guy on the right, you know, took it upon himself to negotiate these treaties. And here's the book, the exercise book, where the Vancouver Island treaties, the Douglas Treaty forms are kept today. So, in spring 1850, he convened leaders from the Songhees area at Fort Victoria, where he had them gather and made a speech about what he wanted to do. And in recognition of this, what he said, blankets were distributed. And this is a slana. This is a potlatch. These people came to hear what he had to say and accepted gifts in acknowledgement that what was said was correct and true and would benefit them and their people. And this is what he told them. You know, he said, this is part of a letter that he wrote to the Hudson's Bay Company. He said, oh yeah, I bought all this land. And he's right, he's talking to two different people. When you read Douglas, you got to read them, you know, different ways. I informed the natives, but this is the critical part, that they accepted. I informed the natives that they would not be disturbed in possession of the village sites and enclosed fields, which are of small extent, and that they are at liberty to hunt over the unoccupied lands and to carry on their fisheries with the same freedom as when they were the sole occupants of the country. So the Siam, they recognize this. You know what he said. They agreed with this and allowed their names to be mentioned. And those of you who've been to Potlatch or Sonic thing, you know, when people are called as witnesses, their family name is mentioned, that name represents a lot of stuff. It's an ancestral name that comes with rights and privileges. To me, this is the Indian side of the Douglas Treaty, the written part of it. These names that were put forward, they would never have their names acknowledged. These names were called out. Douglas wrote them down in his own hand. This gentleman here, Chiesla, signed his name, acknowledged his name up here. 152 years to this very day. Look at this. 10th of May, 1850. Souk. The chiefs of Souk, you know, Douglas went to Fort Victoria. He gave the same speech, and they acknowledged it. And then they distributed blankets amongst the people. All the people were there, and they ripped the blankets up, and each one took a little chunk of it in acknowledgement that what was said was true and acceptable. Shnaima. 1854, same deal. In order to allow the Hudson's Bay Company access to the coal, the most expensive of the Douglas treaties, with the most names, were acknowledged at this treaty. Here we have Suggeston posing in front of his house. His name appears first on this list, below a graphic, a painting, and a sculpture that shows the origin story, one of the origin stories that belonged to his family, and of the Shnaima. 1864, a few years later, Douglas is gone. This was a petition, the Nanaimo Indians to the present governor. I'd like the present governor, you know, these keep coming and going. We want our land upriver to plant for food. Mr. Douglas said it should be ours and our children's after we be gone. We hope you, our new chief, will say the same. And I love this part, and our children's after we are gone. That reflects the language of the written text in the Douglas Treaty. Now it's interesting, Naitabu, the Kemp's deed, you know, with all its promises of food gathering areas and more land, were all, you know, they weren't lived up to. And it's interesting, Tracy Kemp, this is the dude who negotiated the Kemp deed. 40 years later, at a royal commission in New Zealand, where they gathered chiefs, like these were people that were present at this land sale deed. And they said, you know, they gave the true story. And even the guy who wrote negotiated the deed, this is what he had to say. I beg to state that the understanding between the native sellers and myself, as Crown agent, when the purchase of the Canterbury district was made, was to this effect, viz, I guess that's how you say it, that in making a cession of the land they were, in addition to the purchase money, the pas, or places of residence, and the mahingatais, which were then and there reserved or guaranteed to them, they were also to receive ample reserves, from which, in course of time, they might derive considerable rents as means towards securing permanently the comforts and necessities of civilized life. I think I am also bound to say that without these promises, the cession of the land would have been delayed, if not withheld, for an indefinite period of time. So I leave it to you. wonder about what the native side of the story was in terms of Vancouver Island treaties. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our speakers are keeping nicely to their 15 minutes. Our next speaker is Clo Ostrove, a founding partner of Mandel Pinder. And Clo was involved very much in the well-known Sanderson Bay Marina case. Remarkable case. I think up to that point in time, the Douglas Treaties, or should I say the Douglas Forms, the Vancouver Island Treaties, were used as a shield, if you like, against government prosecutions for fishing and hunting violations. In the Sanderson Bay Marina case, I think for the first time, they were used as a sword to actually stop the development of the marina at that time, and Clo was very much involved in that case. Over to you, Clo.
Can I close this, or what can I do with this?
PC.
Or do you want to leave it on? Good morning. Thanks for being here. I want to also acknowledge Snuneymuxw territory, and in particular thank the Snuneymuxw people for such a warm welcome. Treaty cases have looked at rights of hunting and fishing, and as Hamar just mentioned, Sanderson Marina looked at the right to carry on the fisheries as formerly. What did that mean? And what I'm going to talk about this morning is a treaty right to water. And in particular, I'm going to also urge a discussion between the province and Treaty First Nations to explore a collaborative approach to issues of water use, water management, and water allocation. And I begin with this idea that not long after the treaties were concluded, and for more than a century, much more than a century longer, the Crown assumed that it had control of all the lands in the province. And it assumed it because it had passed legislation saying the Crown owns the land. But it turns out it was wrong. It was wrong for a long time, but then everyone learned they were wrong with the Delgamuukw decision. And the Crown takes a similar position with other resources, like trees and minerals, precious and semi-precious, and waters. And the Crown feels confident because the Water Act says the Crown owns the water. The Crown decides who can use the water, how much water, and for what purposes. And that's why the Crown's confident. And I say the Crown is wrong, but at the very least, there is uncertainty. So the question I want to consider is whether Treaty First Nations can claim water rights, and if so, how do these treaty water rights line up with provincially authorized permits and licenses? And I say there is a claim to treaty rights, and if that is so, then provincially authorized permits and licenses are all vulnerable to legal challenge. They're all vulnerable because they're defective. And that's what I'm going to develop a bit more. So I like to begin with a snapshot of what it was like on Vancouver Island in 1850, before treaties were concluded at all. And I really appreciate Chris going first because, as we could see, First Nations were running the show, as he said. And the picture we see is that water is essential to the physical, cultural, and economic well-being of the Aboriginal people. Water is relied on for travel, navigation, fisheries, wildlife, waterfowl, including the habitat to support the fishing and hunting, and water is also relied on for spiritual and ceremonial practices. And if we looked closely, we would see that along with the bundle of rights associated with the use of the water are the inherent responsibilities and obligations to make decisions about the resource in accordance with their own indigenous laws. And then we come to the treaty. And as noted by the Supreme Court in Morris and Olson, the background to the treaty has been ably documented by the courts. And the common intention, as gleaned by the courts, the common intention of the Crown and the First Nation was that the First Nation would remain economically self-sufficient. And indeed, there's historical materials where Governor Douglas makes clear that he does not want the Indians to be a financial burden on the colony. So Governor Douglas intended that the Indians would continue in their way of life, including their traditional hunting and fishing activities. Water is vital to this way of life. Water is vital to the culture. So, as lawyers do, and I'm a lawyer, we build on existing case law, and we build an argument in favor of a proposition. And the proposition here is that Treaty First Nations have rights to water protected by the treaty. And I think there are a number of arguments that could be made, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you could make several in one case, all in support of treaty water rights. And I'm going to outline them very briefly, obviously, but I wish to emphasize this. Aside from any discussion about what the honor of the Crown in the 21st century demands as it relates to 21st century, as it relates to treaty implementation, the fact that the existing case law is able to drive a conclusion in favor of treaty water rights and the practical, on-the-ground uncertainty that would follow such a court ruling should in and of itself bring the Crown to a serious discussion with First Nations about water. Yet the Crown won't show up. And we all bear the risk of the Crown's failure to engage with First Nations on this. So, the arguments I want to identify are grounded in treaty case law. There are as well arguments that could be advanced based on English common law, riparian rights and rights to quality and quantity of water flow and presumptions of riparian owners owning to the midpoint of the waterbed and this kind of thing. And those arguments, those common law arguments are alive. For one reason, when the treaties were concluded, there was no proclamation governing water on Vancouver Island. The Crown hadn't spoken about it. So there was no water regime in place, and the first mention of water is in 1865, and it relates to the preemption legislation and the ability for settlers to also record water records at the same time. But that to the side, you know, how the common law applied on Vancouver Island, it's quite complex and full of debate and so on. So I want to go to the straightforward treaty cases. I'm going to outline briefly 3 areas of treaty law that I think support this. The first is a doctrine that comes from the United States, and it's referred to as Winter's reserved water rights, and it comes up like this. The Fort Belknap Treaty of 1888 was silent as to water. A reservation was established under the treaty. The tribe was to pick up agriculture. That's how it was to be. That was the purpose of the reservation. The Milk River ran through the reserve, but all the settlers were diverting the water, and there was no water available for the tribe. So there was a lawsuit. And in 1908, the US Supreme Court said, well, it's silent as to water, but there must have been water reserved too, because otherwise the reservation of land was not of any use. It would be valueless. So they implied reserved water rights. About a half a century later, in 1963, the US Supreme Court confirmed for the Colorado River Indian tribes, both in Arizona and California, these reserved winters water rights in order to make their reserves in the desert productive. And I just wanted to say this morning when those incredible opening remarks, and I was thinking about 1963, you've got the US Supreme Court confirming substantial water rights for Indian tribes, while Master Beaver Potts is calling Chief White's uncle piggish for presenting his treaty in court. So we're a little behind. In any event, I just want to say about these winters water rights, the court certainly recognizes that and says water is essential to the life of Indian people, and to quantify the amount of water, well, how much water is it? They developed an objective standard, which is referred to as practicably irrigable acreage, and you have all these experts, economists and agrologists going out and trying to figure out, well, how many acres could be irrigated, and that's the amount of water that is reserved under the treaty. It's the first right to use the water. It has priority over any other licensed water by the state. You don't lose it if you don't use it, as you do under our licensing scheme. And it's based not on actual need, what is the tribe using today, but on future needs. So as you can imagine, this has led to, in the United States, very long, hard-fought, painful litigation. Now, I want to make it clear, obviously no court has yet considered in the Canadian context whether the Winters Doctrine applies here. But my proposition is that Treaty First Nations here could certainly import the Winters rationale, water needed to meet the purposes of the village sites and enclosed fields, of the hunting and fishing, and that Treaty First Nations here could establish that sufficient water was impliedly reserved at the time the treaty was concluded. Now, if successful, then the First Nation would be entitled to a court-declared amount of water reserved to the First Nation, and these water rights would be prior and paramount to over any provincial water licenses. So, in my view, I'd say the Winters rights represents a substantial threat to the water status quo in British Columbia. Secondly, and quickly, I'm going to run through two more, if I have that time, is the treaty right to habitat. And this is bouncing off of the Saanich Marina case. We know that the right to carry on fisheries as formerly can restrain a development like a marina if that development would destroy the habitat, like eelgrass, needed to support the fishery. So I think it's fair to say that the treaty fishing right includes the right to habitat to support the fish, and fish habitat means water. And this principle also is established in the United States, particularly up in the Pacific Northwest, where the Stevens Treaty has been interpreted by Judge Bolt, and we see there tribes and states over a long period of time, but eventually coming to co-management, because that's the law and that's the only way it can properly work. Similarly, working together in the Pacific Northwest, not that it's easy, but it's being done, and it has to be done to figure out what are the proper water release operations for in-stream water flows to protect the fish, to protect salmon streams, and so on. So I would say that building on the Saanich Marina case, there is good support for the right to habitat protection. The right to the fisheries, I think, would be hollow if the habitat or the environment upon which the right depends is destroyed. So, on this basis, too, I would say that the Crown's assumption of unilateral control is suspect and vulnerable. Finally, the third treaty case law arm in support that I want to identify briefly this morning is a springboard from the Morrison-Olson case. That case tells us that the province has no constitutional authority to infringe treaty rights, and that provincial laws, like the Water Act, if they do infringe, do not apply to treaty First Nations. So as was said earlier, at the time of treaty, the Crown and First Nations understood and contemplated that First Nations would continue to rely on water to support their way of life, including their village sites, including their enclosed fields, including the hunting, including the fisheries. To the extent that provincial licensing scheme impairs treaty rights because there isn't sufficient quantity of water or quality of water available to treaty First Nations because the province has given it all to somebody else, to that extent, I think, again, there's a strong Morrison-Olson argument. Province can't infringe, those laws don't apply. Morrison-Olson, importantly, also tells us that First Nations have a role in the water management regime in accordance with their own laws to govern the use of and the responsibilities for water into the future. So I would say, given the case law on treaty rights, and the water rights experience in the United States, and not very far from us, not very far from here, it's very curious to me that the province is not coming to the table to discuss with First Nations the future of water resources, their management, and their allocation. And it is this discussion that I would say is the path forward for all people and for all bodies of water. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clo. Our last speaker is Bruce Miller.
First, I want to thank the organizers of this conference and the Nanaimo First Nation. I can remember Chief Douglas White as an outstanding student in my class at UBC many years ago, and I recall standing on the sidelines of the soccer field with Jody Wilson while our sons played together. So there's an interesting reverberation here and all those kind of things. And I also want to say that Clo just showed us that U.S. case law and practices are relevant here. And she mentioned the winter doctrine, and I also want to say that there's some argument been made that the Bolt decision relevant to fisheries also might be relevant here. This isn't in my text, but I'm connecting to you. And just last week, I was working in the state of Washington on the follow-up to that part of the Bolt decision. We had the salmon originally, then the shellfish phase, and now the hunting phase is underway. Thank you. So I want to say that my approach here is comparative, historical. I want to contemplate the unexpected a little bit to perhaps provoke new paths. And I want to talk a little bit about treaty implementation in Puget Sound, as I'm used to it there, and also oral history and its interpretation in law. My understanding of the questions of interpretations of treaties is informed primarily by, and we got these arrows, do we? Okay. By my work over the last 3 decades with Puget Salish people, the immediate relatives of the Georgia Strait Salish we're talking about today and whose land we're on. And further by my work with Fraser Salish, if we want to use that term, I just made it up, and to a lesser extent, those on the island. The changes in Puget Sound community since I began working with them in the mid-1970s are really dramatic, and some are now major economic engines, employers of people from throughout their region. They have control over health, child welfare, law enforcement, and have codified their own visions of justice for their own courts. And much of this has resulted from treaty interpretation and from litigation in the last 30 years. So first, I want to say that treaties are frameworks of agreements. They don't provide definitive answers to many questions, nor ought they. They wouldn't work if they did. They must be living documents, and to do this, they must establish something of the direction of relations among interpenetrating jurisdictions. There's no reason to think that treaty interpretations won't bring dispute. Perhaps it should. In Puget Sound, treaty interpretation has included the dramatic, including the United States versus Washington rights to the salmon harvest, shell fishing proceedings in which I participated 25 years ago, and hunting. More often it is a mundane. I really want to emphasize this point. Treaties really are mostly about the mundane. Agreements between neighboring jurisdictions on jail space, zoning, water, and so on. And sometimes it involves extension of jurisdiction by indigenous authority, as in the case of a local municipal government, recognizing tribal code that forbids cutting the hair of tribal youth, including those incarcerated by the municipality, or the requirement to allow incarcerated people to attend funerals. In these cases, I think local governments simply found it easier to cooperate. Treaties then involve agreements at multiple levels, federal, provincial, local, and local with First Nations. Treaty interpretation in Puget Sound has involved complex wrangling over the meanings of the mid-19th century treaties, as well as understandings of the Aboriginal people gathered to hear. In the United States versus Washington shellfish case, much of the trial turned on historian Richard White's evidence regarding whether fish, which was a word in the treaty, in the 1850s meant shellfish. It did. And in this case, the written law, the black letter law, was contextualized historically. Now I want to do the unexpected. Often inspiration for local problems and new knowledge comes from afar. It should. That's our mainstream society Judeo-Christian tradition of bringing of the law by outsiders, including Moses and Ezra. The Coast Salish tradition of the coming of new powers from other dimensions, underwater or from the sky, is something parallel, I think. Briefly, Moses was a guy who was culturally Egyptian. He was of Jewish ancestry, and he discovered his Jewishness, if we want to call it that, as a young adult, and later became the bringer of the law to the community as a whole. Centuries later, Ezra was a guy who was in Babylon during the period of Babylonian captivity, and he was a Babylonian administrator for sort of the portfolio of Jews. And he went back down to Jerusalem after the destruction of the city 70-something years later, and participated in the reconstruction of the city and experienced the pain of the destroyed city. So in a sort of post-colonial moment for Judeans, and redelivered the law to astonished and shocked Judeans. In all of this discussion, I'm reminded of the Jewish practice of midrash, the finding of meaning in text through new and unexpected insights. Midrash is a way of interpreting biblical stories, myth content, if you want to say it that way, that goes beyond simple distillation of religious, moral, or legal teachings. It fills in many gaps left in the biblical narrative regarding events and personalities that are only hinted at. For Jews of the ancient and medieval world, both oral and written versions of the Talmud were in play. Neither were canonical. Both were relevant, and if anything, the oral took precedent. I'm just trying to say that in either legal background, there's this kind of content, this kind of historical practice we can build on. We can find today that treaty references to the provision of medicine chests mean the right to health services, or the right to fish in common with citizens means that Aboriginal people can harvest half of the catch. These kinds of decisions, one might say, comes out of a very old tradition of adjudication. The oral tradition remains among First Nations and within the mainstream population. And the displacement of the oral comes at a cost. Historian of religion Karen Armstrong wrote, describing the work of the prophet Jeremiah, reservations about the written Torah. This is what Jeremiah is saying. "How dare you say, 'We are wise and we possess the law of Yahweh'," he asked his opponents. "See how it has been falsified by the lying pen of the scribes. The written text could subvert orthodoxy by a mere sleight of the pen and distort tradition by imparting information rather than wisdom." The former Librarian of Congress, Daniel Borstein, captured the sense of this passage in the other great predecessor society to the contemporary world, classical Greece. He wrote, "Plato lived in an age of transition in Athens when the written word was invading the world of learning. And this seems to confirm the warnings reported by Plato of the Egyptian god king Thamos to Thoth, the legendary inventor of writing. This discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learners' souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. The specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence. And you have given your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth." So my point here is that our European and Middle Eastern ancestors, if you have those, were concerned about an overemphasis on writing. They understood that it allowed facts to displace wisdom, and for individuals without tutelage, outside of a relational view of the world, to make claims to truth. Oops, this is a brazen plug for my recent book. So the question now is, what have we done recently about oral knowledge? A brief reminder of some of the issues I took up in that book that I just showed you. So following Delgamuukw, the Crown responded to the crisis, as they perceived it, of the admittance of oral history evidence by creating hostile ways of understanding the oral and disrupting the Aboriginal oral historians. And I want to briefly mention these, and then the last thing I'm going to do is talk about how we can do this today. So these tactics including the emphasis on contagion of two sorts. One is the idea that oral historians who had read the published anthropology and history of their communities were no longer independent sources of knowledge and could be disqualified. And two, that oral histories that had been so-called contaminated by stories of which world motifs were contained are therefore not real histories. World motifs might be something like star children or evil uncles or so forth. So if it's got this kind of content that shows up around the world, then it can't be local and meaningful history. And the court has stumbled on the idea of metaphor, and that words can perform more than one task simultaneously. Oral histories, Cruikshank tells us, contain both insights on contemporary issues of the day and embed direct insights into the past. and so does the Talmud. So that's consistent. And the Crown, so we know about that already in our own ancestry. And the Crown has argued that oral histories fail on the grounds of chronology, unaware of Aboriginal markers of time and context. Finally, the Crown argues that history must be of a particular sort, and the ideas present in oral histories must conform to Western historiography, and that once put on paper, it can simply be analyzed by practices and concepts of outsiders. Contextualization, the usual work of historians, the Crown has argued should be dispensed with. And I don't want to dwell any further on this. I've detailed it in print and in the court. I've suggested to you that both European-derived white people and Aboriginal people have histories of engaging nuance, of incorporating change, of seeing common good. Treaties of all legal documents are inherently about interpretation in light of new understanding and changed circumstances. How am I doing on time, Hamar?
About 4 minutes.
Great. So, how can oral histories and historians be included in negotiations or litigation today? And there are many approaches to doing this, including one which would be to see oral historians as experts. Hutchins et al. Wrote, "We submit that it's high time for our legal system to reconsider the characterization of expert evidence and who may tender such evidence, while the Supreme Court continues to direct that the Aboriginal perspective is important and must be considered by the courts. The people most equipped to provide that perspective and to instruct the courts are still labeled lay witnesses, while scholars, like Chris, who are more often than not from another culture, are considered the experts. Their argument for expert status is buttressed by the notions that elders meet the Mohan test of necessity. The common law tradition could resolve the questions regarding, you don't get that yet, which elders might be qualified as experts if they are accepted by peers in their field and in effect peer-reviewed, and if they are commonly accepted in their community, then they might be qualified as experts. And this potentially addresses several difficulties, including questions of what to do about multiple versions, reliability, and validity. Experts generally in the common law must be reliable, their opinions provable, and generally accepted in their field. A suggestion has been made that communities themselves vet the oral traditional material before entry into the court. A couple of other ideas about how this can be done. One is oral footnoting, something Keith Carlson has written about. This is a practice of many elders simply to reference where their information comes from, who their elders were, and as a way of showing the legitimacy of their oral histories. Another is the ancient documents concept. This is something Michael Ash has brought up. It hasn't succeeded in court that I know of, but in theory it could. There is this premise that after a certain number of years, a document is considered to have withstood the test of time and has a particular legal status as an ancient document. The number of years varies with jurisdiction. But in theory, oral histories could also have that kind of status in court. Another is the idea coming out of criminal law of willful tort. Criminal law suggests in theory that a line of argument for the inclusion of oral historical materials is that the Crown choice to ignore oral traditions might be construed as a willful tort. In this, the government action to, for example, seize land that Aboriginal law says is owned by Aboriginal groups is construed as intentional and willful overlooking of Aboriginal concepts of title. Aboriginal groups might appropriately now insist that their own legal regime regarding land be recognized by the Crown. In this approach, oral traditions are linked to Aboriginal law that is universally understood and recognized by the community. The Crown would then have an obligation to accommodate oral law and to take notice of those articulating it as culture experts and oral historians in the court. And finally, or maybe finally, we might understand oral histories differently, that the most fundamental of those is their broad social role, not as a repository of historical knowledge, but also as an expression of the values and mores of that culture. Common law practices provide a way to understand differences among versions of the same oral historical material. I just want to make this last point. One of the obstructions has been that oral histories might not be the same and over time, but a retort to that is The common law idea allows something to be judged by whether the message contained is the same. For example, there are different versions of the Christian Bible. The Protestant King James Version and Catholic versions from which it was created can be said to express the same difference despite differences in phrasing. So really, my hope is that the future can bring better treatment and deployment of oral knowledge as the treaty implementation continues. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to all four of our presenters for giving us all sorts of things to think about. We now have at least 20 minutes and possibly a little more, because I think lunch doesn't start till 12:30, for questions and discussion from you folks. So perhaps if you'll, oh, hang on. Okay, thank you. So perhaps we can start with you, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters for very interesting information. When I watched Chris Arnett's illustration of the document, I was reminded of something I'd read earlier, that the X's that were made all appeared to have been made by the same hand, and they did not appear to have been made by people who were not used to using pens, particularly the very crude pens of that time. I wonder if you could comment.
Okay, well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Wilson Duff, who did the first sort of study of the Douglas treaties, speculated that Douglas made the X and that the CM put their finger on the pen. So that's probably the process of that. So, but I think the fact that their names were mentioned, I don't think Douglas had a good memory for names. And I think that these names are called out, and he wrote them down as best he could. And some of us are still working on, finding out who these people are, who the names, who the names represent. But yeah, I mean, that's what I understand about the X's.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Wayne Edwards. I'm with the Tamil Treaty Association. I'm a member of the Nanoose First Nation, former chief, tribal chair, and all those other accolades. But anyway, I'd like to thank you all for your presentation and the knowledge that you've been able to gain over a long period of time. However, Chloe, I was remembering something that you were talking about in terms of water, and that's been something that we've worked on considerably, that right to fishes formally. And I've had this discussion with Neil a few times. However, I really appreciate the concepts that you've been able to put forward. The issue, I think, probably that comes to mind for me is the one of the ENN Rail Land Grant. And the ENN Rail Land Grant basically made it, in a sense, private lands. And private lands, there's no existence of a Douglas Treaty claim to any of those properties. And that includes all of the rights to water and things like that. So interesting, and then it's a question that I've asked a number of times, because I know I've met with numerous politicians, and it appears as though at the end of the day, I learned that's a legal term, at the end of the day, you come away with a better way to manage Indians after we've gone through all these meeting sessions. So I'm just wondering if you could comment, Clo, on the ENN Rail Land Grant.
Thank you. Well, obviously that was a huge land grab on Vancouver Island. It's quite interesting in this respect that there is a principle that water is an incident of land. And that principle, it's how land is defined. Land includes everything on and underneath, including, the rivers and whatever, and waters. But On the mainland, there was the transfer of the railway belt, which again was a transfer like the ENN, but a transfer from the province to Canada to build the CPR rail to join BC to the rest of the Dominion. And there was a dispute between Canada and the province as to whether the grant of the lands, the public lands in the railway belt, which was 20 miles on either side of the railway, included water. And because was Canada going to license the water, or was the province? Who could say? Who could say who could use it? Who could say how much could be used between them? And this went all the way to the Privy Council, which in those days, this was 1911, was the highest court for Canada over in England. And they said, yeah, water's an incident of land. And we rely on that for reserves, for Aboriginal title. Water is an incident of land. And similarly, you know, the ENN railway was, you know, just a terrible thing. But I think there's ways to flip it around maybe and use it in our favor on the Aboriginal title side of things. And as Neil argued, there has not been a surrender of the land under these treaties. So I think there are things to be said, but I know the debate is intense. So I hope that's helpful.
Certainly, if any of the panelists want to chip in on these, feel free to do so, sir.
Finding my words very hard.
Hello, my name is Clockleton. I'm English name is Tony Underwood. My question is, on the treaty it says enclosed fields. I'm trying to figure what enclosed fields is, because I've talked to different people and they say they step out of their house, they look out, there's a mountain there, there's a mountain over there, that's my closed field. And so I'm wondering what the panelists have to say about what is in the Douglas Treaty closed fields.
Well, of course, we're dealing with an English concept of enclosed fields, and I think the British had a specific meaning in mind. But I'm just thinking back to the Kemp's deed, the Maori deed. They glossed enclosed fields for our mahinga kai, which, just as you described, this huge vast area that we access for everything, not just food, but cedar or whatever, everything we needed to make a living. And it's the thing about the Douglas Treaty. It's a very narrow interpretation, but it's interesting. I talked to a fella from Chemainus one day, and we were talking about this period in time, and he said that some of them understood this idea and actually built a big honkin' fence, like way into the interior of the island. So, which intrigued me as an archaeologist. I mean, I don't know if there'd be any evidence left, with all the logging and stuff, but it'd be interesting. And I've heard similar stories from your area about somebody building a fence across Saanich. I don't know if that resonates in the oral histories, but I think when I read enclosed fields there, I think of the way you do, this area that we access to make a living.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that most First Nations people are trying to think of. What do they class as that? Because that is in the treaty. That I think when Douglas came here, there was no fields, enclosed fields. No. And I think that came from that interpretation of closed fields came from where you're from. Yeah. And I understand the Douglas Treaty was put in, and that was something that when it went to England, it says, okay, here's the treaty. We'll use your treaty, and that's what they used for Douglas Treaty for us. Yes. And so that makes it kind of hard for us to, think about what is an enclosed field.
But in a way it doesn't really matter, because you got the hunting over the unoccupied lands and the fisheries as formerly. To me, that makes the enclosed fields just, okay, you got a few potato patches with a fence around it. But we also have this vast area. And I love that the phrase fisheries as formerly, because if you read the Washington treaties, which the Bolt decision was based on, the wording in there was your fisheries in common with the rest of the citizens. There's no such qualification in the Douglas Treaty. So it implies to me that it's exclusive access to fisheries, 100%.
Yeah. I don't like to take up too much time, but that is a good question because I sit and talk. I was in a fisher meeting one time and I was talking to DFO and I said, can you talk to me about that Douglas Treaty because I have hunting and fishing rights as formerly, and they say no. And the DFO is trying to tell us how to do that. So it's really neat to to listen to you, the four of you, and talk to you later maybe about different things because I think that's important to some of us. Okay, thank you very much, sir. And ma'am.
I could. The enclosed fields is a peculiar phrase. It certainly doesn't appear in other treaties that I'm aware of, so that where did it come from? It seems to have been a phrase that was perhaps something to do with the Hudson's Bay Company, and that in Victoria, the Hudson's Bay had a number of farms, and its subsidiary, the Puget Sound Company, had farms. And the Hudson's Bay Company in London was very concerned that its farms, that they get title to it and to them, and that their boundaries be established. And in the correspondence, there's mention of enclosed fields in Victoria, meaning that part of the land that the company farms had enclosed, and I think without a great deal of thought they used the same terminology in the Douglas forms, just borrowed the phrase that they were familiar with in that context without giving any thought to what it might mean to the First Nations, to be blunt.
Good morning, my name is Cleetzelton Bill Yoakum. I'm a proud member of Snuneymuxw First Nation, and just a quick comment and a question for the panel is I'd like to thank Mr. Vallance. Well, every each of your presentation, but your presentation hit home to myself, but also my brother Mike, as we're descendants of Joe Wise. So it brings a really, you really feel it. But the question, my second comment for question also, I'd like to thank my friend Wayne Edwards for bringing up the ENN, or the known today as the Island Corridor Foundation, is if we rightfully own it. I keep reading everywhere, we own this. Apparently the First Nations own it. Well, if we own it, then I want those tracks removed from Snuneymuxw where the kids play and our residents reside. But that's a comment I wanted to share. If we own it, why not? Then let's move it. Okay, my question now, before I get off my mini soapbox, is in hearing Clo's presentation in regards to the water rights, and especially in treaty nations such as ours here in Snuneymuxw and other treaty nations as well, our relations, etc., where do we go, and if possible for the province or the Crown of the day that wrongfully granted water licenses back in the day, such as, let's say, in our backyard, like in the 50s, were those licenses wrongfully granted, and is there anywhere we could go? Thank you. That's for Clo or the panel. Heichka.
Well, I think what I mean, as with all rights, if they're not recognized, if there isn't dialogue with the Crown, if there isn't the engagement that was spoken about in the opening remarks this morning, which, we're trying to foster through the discussions at this conference, for one, then there's the courtroom, which isn't very satisfactory. And there's dialogue and figuring out a collaborative approach. And I don't know what other options there are, actually, but I'd love to know, because these issues need resolution. And I know in the United States, some of the adjudications of water, just to give you an idea of the complexity, there'll be thousands, literally thousands of claimants, water claimants, people who claim a right to water in a watershed that all have to be resolved with respect to the validity of the claim, the priority date for the claim, and how much water. And yet they get through them. You know, it's a big task. It's a big task. It's an important resource. So it seems to me in terms of options, where do we go? There either has to be engagement and we find a collaborative approach with the Crown, or there has to be the courtroom. I don't know the other options.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. And I got one question. When First Nations in 1850, they didn't speak the same language. They didn't speak English, and they did not. And the First Nations didn't speak English, and the English didn't speak the First Nations language. They spoke Chinook jargon. Did they translate what was actually said at the Fort Victoria treaties to each other?
Yeah, you could comment, I'll comment.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Very little is known about the quality of the translation that took place at those meetings over the 4 years of the 14 different agreements that were reached. We know the name of the translator at the first ones, and you're right, it was in Chinook jargon, or he might have been proficient in the Senkotan or something like that, one of the languages used by the First Nations locally. But how the concepts that Douglas purportedly was trying to convey, how those were handled in the First Nations, either the jargon, which has a very limited vocabulary, about 900 words, or in the First Nations language between two worlds, I have no idea how that was handled. I wish that Joseph McKay, he didn't really give an answer to whether the translator did a good job or not. And,
I don't think he did.
No, I'll pass it over. Chris knows more about the individual.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm familiar with some of the history of the translator. His name was Thomas Antoine. He was of Iroquois and Chinook ancestry, and he was married to a Hul'quami'num-speaking woman, and I believe that he was multilingual because I sort of followed his career over about 15 years. And I'm sort of taken a different, people sort of always, they look at the text and then they look at what was said. I mean, you have to tease out what was said out of that text. And I hope I made that point in my presentation, that I believe Douglas, he was asking basically for, in exchange for occupying the land, nothing will change. Your life will continue as it has always been, your fisheries, your hunting, and I think that's the only reason that the CM, the leaders agreed, because I think they understood what he said in that way. I don't think he said, I'm buying all your land, because they wouldn't do it. And I base this on the Maori experience, because our people were, some of them, our leaders, were literate and understood the language. So.
And the second is another comment. Did some look at early history of Canada and noticed that some of the treaties negotiated down the states were negotiated by the individuals. Then I see those individuals immigrate to Canada and become the member of parliament. And I wonder if you looked into that. Marshall comes to mind right away in Washington State.
Yeah, around here anyhow, the international border, as you know, was established in 1846. A lot of the personnel were moving through the Hudson's Bay Company area. Douglas was located in what is now Oregon for I think longer than he was here. And he served as a judge for criminal court matters in that jurisdiction. And so there was an argument been made that some people don't buy, but anyhow, that there's a lot of movement of ideas back and forth. The treaties are really quite different. The Treaty of Point Elliot and Medicine Creek and so forth are quite different than these. But nevertheless, there was a regular exchange of information and ideas, and some of the people were the same people. And by the way, a comment on the translation in the Treaty of Point Elliott, for example, it was in Chinook jargon. There is oral histories in communities where I work there about how they understood it. It's clear that they didn't understand it, and they were annoyed by Taylor, the interpreter, an Aboriginal guy who's Chinook jargon. They didn't like what he did at all. And so the point is that we've got to get at the oral traditions that relate to how the communities understood all this.
Morning, everyone. I am Sinupin, Hereditary Chief of the Squamish Nation. We have a treaty, a Douglas Treaty, in place. And it was interesting to hear the challenges that's ahead of us when we want to talk, when we finally have a table to deal with the implementation of our treaty. The roadblocks that's been put in place for us to work through, the barriers, the gaps. Because as Douglas Treaty nations, along with the other treaty nations across Canada, we haven't had a place to bring our treaties. They're still outstanding. As Douglas Treaty nations, we need to work out, define, or whatever we have to do to our rightful place in this land, our homeland. And that's, when we look at the wording, you know, it was the name I carry belonged to my grandfather. And he got it from his grandfather. And his grandfather signed the treaty for Sapsum. Sisinuk was his name. And I guess it's been a struggle to try and get recognition amongst our own people to be able to, for us to stand by us, to stand our treaty up. It was good to hear all the talk this morning about we got to stop being mean to each other. But we have to look at the spirit and intent of what that treaty means to us, our very being, our reason for being. Because when I look at that treaty that was signed by my grandfather before me, they knew what they were setting aside, hunting and fishing. All our laws are connected to those resources, the fish, the animals, the birds. Each one has a name, each one has a ceremony. There's times in our life when we can't even travel over the water, walk on the land, or eat the fish and the ducks and the deer unless the ceremony takes place. Those are the natural laws that was given to us by the Creator. That's our primary right, our primary laws. Now it's up to us to create secondary laws to protect those primary rights under our jurisdictions. We need to be defining those, our rightful place in this land. And I think I look at today as a beginning for all the Douglas treaties to sit down and we talk about that spirit and intent and what that means to us. Because it's with the people. It belongs to the people. They're the ones that have the ceremonies. They're the ones that have the words to look after the people, after the land, after the resources. Because if we fall off that path, then there'll be nothing left. I felt I had to say that because, you know, when I first looked at the agenda, I said, oh, gee, we're going to have all these experts telling us what our treaty's all about. You know, but we're the ones that have to do it in the end. We have to breathe that life into our document and not look at how poor it is because it's rich. Our old people knew what they were doing when they set aside hunting and fishing. Even in the present system, that BC treaty process, they don't have hunting and fishing on there because Canada wants to claim it. They want to give us hunting and fishing. A couple of years ago, DFO phoned my office and wanted to have a meeting with Squamalt and talk about, we want to give you guys a quota, a fishery quota. I says, how can you give me something that I've already got? My old people set that aside for us 150 years ago. So I think we need to be looking at these things and not fall into a trap. We need to lean on our own families back home who have those ceremonies and have the that sacred trust, because it is a sacred trust to the land and the water. But I needed to say something here, you know, because I don't want it heading off in a direction where we're just looking at setting up programs and everything else. We need to be talking about our own jurisdictions. Thank you.
My name is Lo Aitchton. I'm from Stoughton-Alice in the News Bay. Interpretation of the Douglas Treaty, for me, comes to when I get asked from the young guys, you know. My Uncle Wayne always says, what has the Douglas Treaty done for you today, right? And I shrug my shoulders because it takes longer than 10-minute response, right? But for me, it imparts access, right? And it imparts proprietary rights. And we talked about water, talked about fish, we talked about the terra firma a little bit of the enclosed fields. And when we deal with the government, they're undefined rights, right? And so it's left to us to combatively figure out what that means. My friend Squimald mentioned the quotas from DFO, right? And as we move toward implementing interim treaty arrangements or the BC treaty process, we're still holding our Douglas Treaty, right? And when we interpret to those young ones that are, what does that mean, right? What does it do for us? That definition of it, I would like to ask the panel if you feel from a snapshot of today's political status, is that going to come out of case law or is that going to come out of negotiations?
Well, I'll just leap in just because I have a bit of familiarity with New Zealand, maybe legislation, because I showed that Treaty of Waitangi up there. That document meant nothing to Ngāi Tahu. I mean, they negotiated that agreement in the North Island, 40 chiefs signed it, and then some naval officer got in a boat and shipped it around, tried to find as many people as they could to sign it. Only they visited 3 communities out of about 17 communities on our island, and so we basically ignored that treaty. We focused on that deed, that purported land sale deed that became the model for the Douglas Treaty, and that was but it didn't really have any teeth until the New Zealand Parliament recognized the Treaty of Waitangi for what it was. Before that, it was just some funky document. And then in 1980, they said, okay, this is a legitimate treaty. They set up a tribunal that went and looked into it in real detail. And I think that's what could happen here if we had a government that would agree to that process.
Chief Gordon Planis, Hayakwacha from Sauk. I want to echo a little bit of Chief Andy Thomas's words. the things that are happening in our traditional territory. Chloe, I really like the words you spoke earlier about water. And the water that we're talking about is not just fresh water. We have the smokehouse lakes where we use them for not only for the water, but we use them for hunting as well. But the water that I want to talk about is the water that's in the ocean. Because when that tide goes out, that's where our gardens are. And I think when First Contact came by, they didn't understand that our gardens were in the hills for our blue cama potato. And our gardens were on the beach when the tide went out for our clams. And we're in a situation today where you have to go through a 10-year process and a licensing process through the governments. And I've spoken to the governments about this. I said, you guys should be coming to us and asking us for permits. We should not be going to you. And the thing is that water is sacred, and we don't think of fresh water or salt water any different. It's all water, and it's very sacred to us. Now, these kind of things that are going on in the treaty process, we're trying to make governments understand who we are. And the only problems we have, there's too many levels of government for everyone to understand. And I think that's the problem with our Douglas Treaty, is that we're not getting governments to come down to the beach and take a look at our clam beaches. And I think that's where it starts. And the other thing is that I want to tell you, Chloe, I'm going to be giving you a call. Because we need those tools. We need those words that as elders and people in our community cannot say, but we need those things that are important to be able to go to government and make that change. And I think that's why I'm, the main reason we're all here is for change. And I'm frustrated and I'm tired to know that we have a right, a Douglas Treaty right, and it's been picked apart, and I want to see change. I want the government to come to me and say, we want to do something in your traditional territory. Is it all right if we use this beach over here? That's where we got to get. And somehow, I'm going to keep fighting until we get that, because we have to make that change for better for all our people. So I wanted to pass that word along, and that's the reason I'm here today. Ayishka Sam.
At this time, I would like to call upon Nanaimo Councillor James Seward. Just come stand here. Bruce Miller, Dr. Bruce Miller. Chris Arnett. Neil Vallance. Clo Ostrove. And of course, we would like to thank the moderator, Hamar Foster. Hamar.